What's up, lore masters? So today I thought I'd phone it in. You know, do some lore in an older video game and not have to worry about the pomp and circumstance. I mean, it's not like one of the major influences of Starcraft is going to be interested in my video. Son of a bitch! In order to understand the Terran Confederacy, a brief history of how humanity became a power in the Korhal sector is required. I won't be going too in-depth, I'll have to see how popular this video is beforehand, but long story short, some people on Earth had decided they wanted to begin expansion into deep space. So in that vein, they began construction of ships known as supercarriers. Supercarriers were designed with the ability to travel through deep space, and these vessels would be able to carry a large complement of people an extraordinary long distance. Once constructed, the first of these was loaded up with prisoners and sent out for colonization. Basically, they wanted to make Australia in space. The ship's original destination was Gantris 6. Unfortunately, it would never make it, and ultimately, due to the navigation system malfunctioning, the vessel would land on a planet known as Tarsonis. The ship would revive its crew, and the populace within would rise and begin rebuilding, and some of them would ultimately found the Terran Confederacy. The Terran Confederacy would also be known as the Confederacy of Man, Confederation, and Confederates. Also, ensuring this video won't be monetized, the flag of the Confederacy would be the Navy Jack, at least as of the upload of this video. I'm sure Blizzard will change that at some time. The Confederacy would also have its own anthem known as "To the Eternal Glory of the Confederacy." Charming. Ultimately, the Confederacy was extremely corrupt, with the true power being firmly in the hands of the old families. The old families consisted of the descendants of the original ship, the Nalfagar, that landed on Tarsonis. These peoples would become an oligarchy, even though the government claimed to be a confederacy that was ruled through democratic ideals. The government would be split into at least three parts, the executive being ruled by the Confederate Council, with the Commander-in-Chief being Confederate High Command, and the legislative branch was controlled by the Confederate Senate. While the Confederate Senate specifically would be democratically elected, I could find no evidence that the Confederate Council was also elected in any kind of form. Being founded in 2323, the government would begin an expansionist policy, settling new worlds and colonies quite quickly. This included, but wasn't limited to, the worlds of Tirador 8, Credor, also known as Braxis, New Folsom, Chelsara, Marsara, Agria, and even Char. As I've talked about quite a few times, the Confederacy is widely considered to be among the more corrupt governments of its time. However, even with this issue, it would have a wide range of advancements in the sciences as well as military advancements. As an example, Agria was terraformed from a barren fringe world to a small farming colony with advanced technology and, wait for it, terraforming. Additionally, some of the most innovative research for its time would be done on this planet. The Confederacy military had top-of-the-line technology and training as well. This very military would be tested in what came to be known as the Guild Wars. Again, this may be something I get into at a later point, but the key points here are to note that the Confederacy and Kelmorian combined would break into open war, largely due to the Confederacy stealing Kelmorian mining claims. The war spread from Char to Sanyan, Artesia Prime, and Taraxis II, and lasted nearly 4 years. The Confederacy began to lean hard on all of its populace during this time, though specifically farmers were hit the worst. The government would tax the populace more and more in order to fund the war. And, as with most wars, the old families, profited largely from this war at the expense of the Confederacy's people. It would be during this conflict that the Confederacy identified a new alien life form. The Xeno would ultimately become known as the Zerg. In 2487, after discovering the Zerg, the Confederacy attempted to hide the aliens' existence by engineering a cholera epidemic on fringe worlds where the Zerg were found. In 2489, the Kelmorian Combine and Confederacy signed a lopsided treaty, and this treaty would ultimately ensure the dominance of the Confederacy as their territory and resources were bolstered greatly. The resources would be utilized to broaden the abilities of the Confederate military. However, as I mentioned a moment ago, this came at an extreme cost to the citizenry of the Confederacy. The old families became renowned for abusing Confederate colonies, creating one-sided arrangements that would leech resources from the colonies with no tangible benefit. These arrangements often inspired civil disobedience, generally in the form of riots. One of the more notable events was the Rebellion of Korhal. Now that lore is outside the scope of this breakdown, but the most notable points include the Korhal revolt against the Confederacy, the Confederacy removal of its military assets, and ultimately the Confederate battlecruisers deuce vaulting the planet with more nuclear weapons than God himself could field, which resulted in the creation of the Sons of Korhal and the desertion of multiple military units. While all this was happening, in the background, the Confederacy continued to experiment with the Zerg, trying to cultivate them as a weapon on fringe worlds. This would gain the attention of the Protoss, who dispatched an expeditionary force to the sector to remove the Zerg infestation. Chowsara would be incinerated by this force. Of course, the Confederacy would attempt to respond and attack the Protoss, but the battle would go about as you expect, with the Confederates suffering a devastating loss. At this point forward, the Confederacy would begin to crumble as it battled against internal insurgencies, the Protoss Expeditionary Force, and the Zerg infestation that was able to spread outside of the quarantine zones due to the previously mentioned conflicts. The Confederacy would attempt to bolster its ranks with news propaganda, but ultimately it was too little too late. They couldn't stop the tide. Under the onslaught, the Confederacy would fracture and be destroyed when the central defense platform was assaulted by Alpha Squadron and a Zerg infestation overran the cities of Tarsonis. By this time, the Confederacy had created innovations to combat the Zerg, including the Psi Disruptor and Diamondbacks, but would not be able to utilize them as they were already overrun. The old families and their children would be hunted down by the Terran Dominion, an empire that rose from the ashes of the Confederacy. Most of the remaining assets, including its military, would be destroyed or absorbed into the new Terran Dominion. The remnants of the Confederacy that would not bow to the Terran Dominion would become mercenaries, independent states, or join the Confederate Resistance Forces. The Confederate Resistance Forces would ultimately become conscripts of the United Earth Directorate during the Brood War. Removing the fact that it was named after the Confederacy of the United States Civil War, the government was a mixed bag. It was definitely a corrupted state that oppressed its people, but also had innovations and would provide protection to its populace. And it can definitely be argued that the Confederacy was no worse or better than that of the Terran Dominion. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and as always, guys, all of our lives are just a story. Make yours a good one.